So I was dating this girl in college, kind of. I guess we started dating right before Christmas break without really going on a date yet. Well, over the break, I was kind of thinking we should take a break. I didn't really want to go out with her. I asked my friends, what should I do? They suggested I better just break up with her. But breaking up is hard to do. I mean, what am I supposed to say? Can I just not call her? She'll get the point, right? See, nowadays there's a word for that. It's called ghosting. But back then, my friends who were girls gave me a look that pretty much said, no, and you're a horrible person for even considering that. Have you ever had to break up with someone? Or have you had someone break up with you? Neil Sedaka is right. Breaking up is hard to do. You can pull like a stanza and try to say, it's not you, it's me, but the results are never good. Breaking up is hard to do. It's not just dating either. Sometimes you have to move and leave friends behind. When will you see each other again? No one knows. Breaking up is hard to do. I always hated leaving jobs, having to tell my boss, sorry, I won't be coming back to the Little Caesars Pizza anymore. And I really hate the process of looking for a new church. Sometimes churches want you to come out and visit. You have to say, no thanks. And the absolute worst was telling the church I'd been at for 8 years I was leaving. After my sermon here in the congregational meeting, I went and drove over to the Panera and sat in the parking lot and made phone calls. I had to call every elder on session and give them the news and call a special session meeting. I hated making those phone calls. Sorry, it's not you, it's me. Breaking up is hard to do. When you're a teacher, it's hard to break up the cliques and separate two best friends who can't keep quiet when they're together. They'll whine and complain and still try to find a way to communicate. It's hard and even dangerous to break up a fight between dogs, people, or nations. Have you ever had to try and break yourself of a bad habit? Break a group of a way of thinking? Break with a tradition? Breaking up is hard to do. In the Gospel of Mark, we're invited to the room where it happens, Jesus' last Passover meal with his disciples, just before he breaks away from them and returns to God. He tries to warn them that the order of his life and the order of their lives is about to be broken. The communal relationship upon which they had come to depend is going to be broken apart. They are at the breaking point. To make the point clear, in the middle of their meal, Jesus commandeers a loaf of bread and breaks it apart. He tears the jagged, separated pieces away from the main body and distributes them to his followers gathered at the table. This is me, says the man whose body will soon be broken on a Roman cross. This is you, says the man whose body of followers, broken by fear and broken of heart, will soon scatter as far from their Jesus and each other as they can get. Breaking up is hard to do. How does anyone survive such a devastating breakup? Jesus offers an ironic proposal with the crumbs he has just created. He shows them how to fight the brokenness with broken food. He shows them that brokenness is their wholeness. The bread is the key. Jesus doesn't symbolize a whole community or his own complete messianic ministry with an intact loaf. When he tells them who they are, who he is, he shows them broken bread. Bread for Jesus in Mark's gospel is always about brokenness, but it is a brokenness that oddly enough creates the wholeness God seeks. In Mark's gospel, bread represents the breaking down of the boundaries that Jesus spent his whole ministry trespassing. legal boundaries, holiness boundaries, purity boundaries, ethnic or racial boundaries, the kind of boundaries that made some people impure, others unclean, others unacceptable in spiritual, ritual, social, and political ways. Jesus disrupted those boundaries and left in their decimated wake a trail of broken bread and brokenness that ran all the way to the cross. You see, at Mark 2:26, bread is a narrative accomplice to Jesus' challenge to the traditional understanding of Sabbath. Healing the sick and feeding the hungry had somehow become unlawful works that could no longer be performed on this sacred day. Jesus, believing that the law had been intended to promote healing and wholeness rather than hinder them, broke such an interpretation of the Sabbath apart with breadcrumbs all over his hands. In Mark 3:20, Mark makes the awkward statement that the crowd around Jesus is so large that he and his disciples cannot eat bread. That reference stands smack in the middle of this scene where Jesus reconstitutes Israel as a people not based on blood or nationality, but on obedience to the will of God. Anyone could belong. Imagine a community of people built not on blood or birthright, but obedience to a communal vision. As far as Mark was concerned, Jesus broke up Israel as it was in order to make room for Israel as it could be. America, you great unfinished symphony, what could you be? What could we be if we could break up what divides and harms and holds back? In chapter 6, Jesus breaks bread in order to feed 5,000 people in Jewish territory. In chapter 8, Jesus breaks bread again, this time to feed 4,000 on Gentile soil. His actions are so destructive to the boundaries that have been cooked up to keep Jew and Gentile apart that he must immediately fight with the righteous folk over his authority to do such a radical breaking up thing. Mark's point is this: the bread Jesus gives to the people of Israel, he also makes available to the Gentiles. Jesus' bread breaks down that great ethnic barrier that separated all of God's people from each other into divisive, hostile racial camps. Nowhere is that point made more clear than when Jesus compares the healing of a Syrophoenician woman's daughter to the sharing of the children's bread with Gentile dogs. When Jesus breaks off a piece of that healing bread and shares it with the Gentile woman and her daughter, he breaks down the ethnic racial barrier that even his disciples wanted upheld. Only through the breaking of the racial ethnic boundary that had become so stable and systemic that it was revered as sacred could he establish the radical, unpredictable wholeness of one human family that God had always intended. Jesus goes around Israel in Mark's gospel with this sense of urgency and crumbs on his hands. The text is constantly saying, immediately Jesus went, immediately Jesus did. The man is nonstop. He's breaking bread like he's running out of time. And he is. Jesus uses bread to break stuff up. Miraculously, though, Jesus' bread breaking does not tear down. It builds up. It shatters the old in order to shape the new. The broken bread that represents his broken body is the epitome of this paradox. Jesus intends to complete God's mission, to make that mission whole by breaking himself and breaking apart the community he had spent so much energy and resolve to put and hold together. That is his supper. This is our supper, the meal we commemorate when we eat together. When we come to this table, when we break this bread, do we have any idea what the breaking, the brokenness really means? What it commits us to? I ask this question because I think that once we understand what the brokenness of this meal means, we'll come to this meal with a bit more humility, maybe a healthy bit of fear and trembling. We aren't real afraid, though, or worried, not of little teeny bits of broken bread and many little cups of juice, not of what we remember or we proclaim, not of the meal, not of the brokenness it represents. We are comfortable. We say the ritual words, we toast to Jesus. We religiously see the bread, we piously watch it break, and when the time comes, we faithfully pick up our little piece from the tray or the plate we prepared in front of us. We don't even actually participate in the breaking. If we think of something at all besides a lunch plans, or are we going to end in an hour, we tend to think of how much the meal has nourished us. We say the religious answers of how it reminds us of Jesus' sacrifice or that it nourishes our faith, but we don't think much about what the meal commits us to do. We don't think as much about how the meal memorializes a brokenness that we are being called to recreate in our world and lives today. Because we know just how hard breaking up is to do. But what if? What if we broke up the comfortable worship the way Jesus broke up the bread at the table? What if in the brokenness we ended up next to people we don't know, don't understand, and perhaps don't even like? I mean, we want church to be a comfortable place, a secure place, a satisfying place. I get it. But we table transformative possibility because we like our boundaries. If we wall ourselves off, we don't have to engage with new ideas, new worship preferences, new people with new needs and ways of speaking and engaging, beliefs and traditions. We can keep it the same, what we're used to, and that's more comfortable because we like whole food. And especially whole bread and a whole lot of continuity and homogeny. Because breaking up our groups, our ideas, our assumptions, our belief, even our worship is hard to do. Now, I imagine that the very suggestion of breaking the agendas of social, political, and religious activism into the comfortable spirituality of the Eucharist meal over any meal, for that matter, has the potential to cause, as Brian Blunt says, as much acid indigestion as prophetic provocation. But that is a good thing, Dr. Blunt, the president of Union Seminary in Richmond, says. Because he says, when you think about the meal that we Christians partake in order to root ourselves into Christ by remembering Christ's ministry and the reasons why that ministry was so subversive, so disruptive, that the leaders of his world put him to death on a cross in order to bring that ministry to a halt, indigestion is exactly the right image with which to work. You see, the Eucharist meal is all about creating indigestion in the world in which the meal is eaten. Dr. Blunt says, there is no pious Pepto-Bismol, no ritual Rolaids, no theological Tums, no apostolic Alka-Seltzer that can dissolve the transformative rumblings that come from this meal. To be spiritually rooted in this meal of brokenness is to be called to transformative, boundary-breaking social, political, and religious action. If we would be who God intends us to be, we must be broken. If our world is to be the world God intends it to be, we must rise up and figure out a way to break it toward God's design. Are there people trapped? Break the chains that bind them. Are there people hungry? Break the conditions that starve them. Are there people who have just given up? Break the hopelessness that debilitates them. Are there people who can't provide what they need, break the social conditions that impoverish them? Are there people treated unjustly, break the laws that condemn them? Are there people who don't believe, break the faith that has disappointed them? Do not throw away your shot, because there are boundaries that keep you, the people you know and the people you don't know, the people you love and the people you don't care about, trapped in lives that don't allow them to reach the completeness, the fullness, the potential that God intends for them. We cannot wait for it. We must find those boundaries, find those systems, and break them down the way Jesus broke apart the bread. We are a broken world, filled with broken relationships, broken trust, broken systems, broken hearts, broken lives. It can sometimes seem like too much. There are moments when we're in so deep, it seems easier to just swim down. But at this table, with this meal shared by people of all colors and nationalities, economic statuses, age and culture and genders, we remember that it is brokenness that causes us to be whole. We commit to breaking up those things that keep us from communion. We feed on brokenness in the faith that God breaks sin and death's hold over us. Forgiveness. Can you imagine? There are moments that the words don't reach. There's a grace too powerful to name. And it comes to us through brokenness. Breaking up is hard to do. God knows. But it is the only way to wholeness. We must break up so many of our ideas, the ways we thought the world worked, the way we often think our history has worked, the way we think we judge people. We must break apart the walls we kind of build up around ourselves to keep ourselves safe from having to see what's actually out there. Break the film over our eyes. Break apart the divisions that we create among nations and political parties, neighborhoods, and so much more. We have to be willing to break apart so much of our lives, our thinkings, and our attitudes. Because we're so quick to demonize this or that, to make a quick judgment about this thing or that thing without having all the information, because we want those easy, comfortable answers. We have to break apart that desire for easiness, for comfortableness, for generalizations, and come to a table with a man who was very complex, who broke things to make them whole again, who broke laws in order to refashion them, who broke his body in order to live again. So let's come to this table, the table of wholeness and life, and remember what was broken and what we're called to break apart for the life and the wholeness of the world and all of God's children. So come to this table and eat the broken bread and remember the broken body and what it commits you to now and forever.